in the last 2 years. AT&T has means to make things right. A victory for CWA is a victory for our community because it demonstrates that collective action can compel those in power to change. The second struggle that we wanted to uplift involved the United Teachers of Dade. So our governor, Ron DeSantis, has targeted public sector unions within the state with a particular focus on the United Teachers of Dade. On June 10th, UTD held a press conference urging teachers to vote. The governor held a press conference on June the 10th, urging teachers to vote against joining their union in an ongoing effort to decertify that particular local. This is a battle where the stakes are high for both labor and community. Ron DeSantis wants to strip away all rights, claiming there's no need for union contracts. But in time, when local laws protecting workers and community rights are being preempted to the state legislature, the union stands as our last line of defense here in the Sunshine State. Now, as we shift our focus to the international stage, let's talk about Venezuela. You might ask, what does labor have to do with this? Why should we care when we have our own pressing issues? Well, companies like AT&T and ExxonMobil would prefer we stay in our lane and mind our own business. But the reality is that their actions abroad are deeply intertwined with our struggles here at home. AT&T has been in Venezuela since the 1990s, facing mass protests for their service, rate increases, and treatment of workers. ExxonMobil's history there dates back to the 1930s, and its operations have long been marked by exploitation. These companies, driven by the same financial institutions, Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street, who control significant portions of AT&T and Exxon, are motivated by profit at the expense of workers everywhere. Their influence is vast, yet often hidden, driving up prices and exploiting workers both here and abroad. And it's not just limited to telecommunications or oil. These financial giants even own real estate companies, jacking up our rents, and they care nothing about you and me. So what does labor have to do with Venezuela? Everything. We must open our eyes and recognize that our sisters and brothers globally and understand who's pulling strings for profit. That's what tonight's forum is about, clarifying those connections. And for those Venezuelan workers who are coming here because of poverty and conditions worsened by US sanctions, our policy should be clear. We should reach out in solidarity and organize, because the system of exploitation that they flee is the same system they're stepping into. With that, I'll turn it over to our Masters of Ceremony for this evening, Jeff Bigelow, who will be coordinating this program forward. Jeff, floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicholas. Our first speaker tonight is Audrey Bomse. And Audrey is a longtime member of the National Lawyers Guild and an official observer of the election in Venezuela. Audrey Bomse, the floor is yours.
Okay. All right, let me get the video working. Okay. All right, I was part of the 5-member National Lawyers Guild delegation of election observers to Venezuela last month. It was my 3rd time observing the elections. Just to preface my remarks, the Venezuelan elections were once called the best in the world by former President Jimmy Carter. Now, the first time I observed was in 2013. That was after Hugo Chavez died and Maduro won the election to replace him. But the results were challenged by the opposition, whose candidate at the time was Enrique Capriles. The National Election Council, that's the CNE, held a full audit, which showed that 99.98% consistency between the electronic results produced by the voting machines and the paper receipts. But just like now, the opposition refused to participate in this process. The second time I observed the elections was in 2018. And that was when the US claimed fraud 6 months in advance of the election. And a year later recognized Juan Guaido as the interim president. And the US was the only country in the world not to recognize Venezuela's newly elected government. So you can see there's a pattern, a long history of both the US and the Venezuelan opposition challenging election results. So I'm going to be talking about the electoral process itself. And on the 28th of July, we visited a number of polling places in and around Caracas, where we observed thousands of voters participate. We witnessed no instances of fraud or serious irregularities. And we found that there was overall, the voters and the witnesses from all the parties involved were satisfied with the electoral process. And I just want to state that every party was allowed to have their witnesses at every polling place. We spoke to people pretty much at random, but also we made a point of talking to witnesses from the opposition parties, including the Unitary Platform, that's the PUD, the main opposition party. Actually, it was a political alliance of parties whose candidate was Edmundo Gonzalez. Some of the polling places had long lines, but overall, what we saw was an efficient and voter-friendly process. At one of the polling stations that we visited, that was the Simon Rodriguez National Library Parish polling station in Caracas, which accommodates 2,100 voters. Over 800 had already voted by 10:50. And only one voter of the many that we spoke to expressed concerns regarding the soundness of the electoral system, and he was a member of the opposition party. The level of voter participation was approximately 59%. And the US media has shifted the narrative into discussion of the minutiae of the Venezuelan electoral procedures, ignoring the much bigger issue, which other people I'm sure will talk about after me, of US interference in the internal affairs of another sovereign country. Both the US media and the government have been involved in destabilization campaign in Venezuela before, during, and after the election. So just now, briefly for the minutiae, Venezuela's presidential elections are single voter, are single round process won by plurality. Since 1998, when Chavez was elected president, elections have been automated using what's called direct recording electronic voting machines. Those are DRE machines, which provide a voter verified paper audit trail. So technically, it's just about foolproof, the process. Venezuelans go through what's called the electoral horseshoe to cast their ballots. The first station sees voters run their fingerprints through a biometric ID machine, which stops people from voting in more than one parish. Once cleared, they move on to the touch screen. After picking their preferred candidate, The machine prints out a paper backup confirming the choice that's to be deposited into the ballot box. The fourth and final station has voters sign and stamp their fingerprints on the electoral record. The total number of votes has to match the electronic tally and the electoral record. The whole process is witnessed, as I said, by members of any political party that wants to have witnesses. After the polls close, there are 45% of voting machines are randomly chosen for an audit to compare the electronic totals with the paper tallies. The results that were announced after midnight on July 28th showed Maduro was reelected in a really tight race with 51.2% of the vote, whereas leading challenger Edmundo Gonzalez took 44.2% of the vote. It was announced that the delay was due to a massive cyber attack on the electoral system. As we all know, the opposition again alleged fraud and produced what they said were tallies from the voting machines that differed from the results declared by the National Election Council. The issue got brought to the Venezuelan Supreme Court, that's the TSJ, where the opposition once again refused to participate. They refused to produce their evidence of fraud. This is the evidence that they waved around to the international press. So eventually, the Supreme Court declared the opposition leader, Gonzalez, as in contempt of court. It also said that it was going to submit all the results to the Attorney General for criminal investigation into fraudulent documents, conspiracy. The TSJ ruled, and I'm just going to quote, the bulletins issued by the CNE, which is an independent branch of government that oversees the election, are categorically validated. So what they did, they validated the election results and sent a copy of the decision to the Attorney General, and it noted just like that publication of the election results was done within 30 days as required by the Venezuelan Constitution. So now the issue comes down to how does the U.S., where no candidate for office is competitive unless they represent corporate interests, how does the U.S. consider itself to be the ultimate arbiter of what constitutes democracy in other countries? And why should anybody look up to the U.S. as a good arbiter of election integrity when it's constantly interfered in other countries' elections and has a huge fairness problem of its own? I was going to go into some of the electoral problems that we have in the U.S., but in the interest of time, I'm going to stop now and just say that it's really important for us in the U.S., for the anti-imperialist left, to reject and to denounce the attempted coup d'etat by the U.S. and by the Venezuelan opposition against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. And I know that there are left groups, supposedly left, like Jacobin, like NACLA, which have come out criticizing the election. It's what I call kind of U.S. left exceptionalism, and we have to really fight against that and support the Venezuelan attempt for sovereignty, self-determination. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And it's a much needed clarification because, as you said, there's a lot of confusion on that issue because it's influenced by the New York Times and all the big business press that tries to make it seem as if there were no election results, as if it wasn't fair. And you've certainly brought some clarity to those points. Our next speaker tonight is Corinna Mullin, a professor at the John Jay College of Law, an official observer of the election, an author, and someone who has a great deal of knowledge about the systems and impact of sanctions and important context for this election. And she has a lot of information, a lot of experience with the systems of imperialism. So Corinna, take it away. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you, Lorenzo, as well, for inviting me to speak at this very important event, and to the Labor Community Alliance for all of the excellent work you're doing. So I'm in my brief presentation, and since Audrey, who was in the same delegation that I was part of, the National Lawyers Delegation, has already covered the electoral process, I am going to talk a little bit, zoom out a bit, and talk a little bit about the global context and the sort of why behind US intervention and the constant attempts to delegitimize and ultimately undermine and overturn the free and fair elections that we witnessed take place in Venezuela. So I understand this US-backed coup that was represented by the right-wing violence that both preceded as well as followed the elections as part of a broader hybrid warfare, really not just against Venezuela, but against the global South more generally, against really global South sovereignty, and in particular against those anti-systemic states that challenge the capitalist core, meaning the US and other Western capitalist states, ability to control the resources and wealth of the global majority. Election interference in the form of questioning the legitimacy of the outcome of free and fair elections in order to sow doubt in the minds of populations and justify intervention is now a tool, a mechanism of empire that has been used beyond just Venezuela. We've seen it, and it's used in multiple instances of elections whose outcome the US is ultimately unhappy with. And that includes Brazil in 2022 with claims of fraud by Bolsonaro after losing to Lula, Bolivia 2019 with false fraud claims against Evo Morales leading to a coup, and of course previous false fraud claims against Maduro as well. And hybrid warfare, I should say, in Venezuela it also includes various waves of violence, including the various waves of violence between 2014 and 2017, support for Juan Guaido's so-called interim presidency, the illegal seizing of Venezuelan assets abroad, including 31 tons of gold in the Bank of England, and the more than 930 brutal US sanctions against Venezuela that have led to the unnecessary deaths of tens of thousands and have undermined the living standards of millions of Venezuelans, leading to increased migration and really undermining the material basis of the Bolivarian socialist revolution. As well as, of course, the short-lived coup d'etat against Chavez, President Hugo Chavez in 2002, and the failed coup attempt against Maduro in 2019. And I just want to say, because Audrey mentioned Edmundo Gonzalez, there's also Corinna Machado, who is very closely connected to Gonzalez, the other sort of right-wing opposition leader. And I think this is important to mention because she has backed every single example that I've just mentioned of hybrid warfare against Venezuela. And important to mention in the context of the ongoing brutal US-backed imperialist Zionist genocide in Gaza, that she's also, of course, not surprisingly, very close to Israel, and in fact, called on Benjamin Netanyahu to support a military intervention in Venezuela in 2018. All of these examples of hybrid warfare aim to discipline states for exercising sovereignty and to maintain or reintegrate global South countries into the global capitalist economy as subordinate primary commodity exporters and sources of cheap and super exploitable labor. So hybrid warfare is really about stabilizing capitalist relations inside the imperialist core by perpetuating wealth extraction from the periphery. So why are they so interested in Venezuela? Well, I think, the US imperialism has to do with two factors in particular. First, Venezuela's socialist model of development, with, of course, like all states and all models of development have, of course, its own internal contradictions, but nonetheless has made extraordinary accomplishments in terms of supporting improving the lives of the working class, the popular classes. We know, for example, the communes, the reason that the communes are so supportive of the Maduro government and before Chavez has to do with the fact that that PSUV has been so supportive of that project of autonomous development, of empowering the working class. And democracy in Venezuela goes beyond just the elections to the popular assemblies, for example. And the communes really represent a working class model for the rest of the world. And we rarely hear about that, even in the so-called left media here. So that, of course, represents a threat to US imperialist interests and the ability to exploit the resources and the population of Venezuela. Secondly, I would say, and of course, the neoliberal agenda of the right-wing opposition, which also we rarely hear about in the Western media and the mainstream media in this country. That their main aim is to reverse these gains. They have a very neoliberal agenda. They want to reverse the nationalization. They want to privatize state industries. They want to abolish free healthcare, reduce social spending, reduce worker protections, deregulate labor markets. Of course, that's what they represent. Secondly, and another reason, main reason why Venezuela is targeted by US imperialism is Venezuela's challenge to US imperialism in the context of a rising multipolar world order. And that has led to an important part of the crisis of US imperialism today and the decline of US hegemony. So China, for example, is seen as a major threat to US imperialism and it today represents the largest trading partner of Latin American countries. And there are, of course, other important actors as well, like Russia and Iran. One of the reasons why Alex Saab, for example, the Venezuelan diplomat, was targeted was because he was defying, he representing as a diplomat Venezuelan interests, defying US sanctions through trade with Iran. And Venezuela has really been at the forefront of this shift, challenging US hegemony through its Bolivarian revolution. And that was initiated by Hugo Chavez in 1998. As I said, this revolution was not just about domestic reform, but also it was a bold move to resist US imperialism and promote Latin American sovereignty. Venezuela's growing relations with countries like China, with the BRICS countries, and with other anti-systemic actors like Russia and Iran are significant in this regard. And these relationships are part of a broader strategy to reduce dependency on the US and resist its influence in the region. So, for example, Venezuela played a crucial role in the establishment of regional organizations like the Community of Latin America and Caribbean States, CELAC, and the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, ALBA, both of which aim to foster regional integration and reduce US control. Also, Venezuela has attempted to trade outside of the dollar, and of course, that's a challenge to US dollar hegemony. Are working to create an alternative regional currency, Sucre. And that, of course, also poses a challenge to US dollar-dominated global economy. And this is really gets to the heart of why Venezuela is seen as such a threat to US empire. I wanted to also say a few words about why countries like, why it is, what are the institutions, or what does it look like, this challenge to Venezuelan sovereignty, not just in terms of the attempted coup, but also we've seen recently the US, along with right-wing allies in the region, has made repeated attempts to destabilize Venezuela, including the Organization of American States. So they depend on their regional allies, their regional lackeys in the region to do their work. So the OAS called for, has recently also attempted to intervene with a resolution seeking to undermine Venezuela's democratic process and undermine its sovereignty. Even center-left governments like Brazil and Chile, for example, have played a very, very damaging role. And I can talk about that later. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. But, the main reason being, it shows you that these countries are still under the boot of US imperialism. They really don't, even though they, there are attempts to move in the direction of more left-wing government. Of course, they still are under the boot of US imperialism, are not exercising their sovereignty to the full extent because of their military and economic relations with the US. And that is precisely why Venezuela is such a threat to the US, because it refuses to go along with the US diktat. So I just want to say, in some, the delegation that I was part of, the National Lawyers Guild delegation, and the People's Tribunal on US imperialism that I'm part of, and I visited last year Venezuela with, we understand US interference in Venezuela as reflecting this multi-pronged strategy to upend the Bolivarian revolution, to undo the democratic victories of the people, and to replace the People's Republic with yet another US vassal state that would permit US exploitation and subjugation of the resource-rich nation. Venezuela has the largest oil supply in the world. We hope that, everyone here today and continues, those who are already involved, we hope you continue, those who are not, get involved in standing in solidarity with the people of Venezuela as they continue their proud legacy of standing up to US imperialism. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Corinna. That was great. And it's always good to listen to you, always good to hear you, always learn something. Thank you for putting the elections in the context of critically important global political and economic dynamics and defining why Venezuela is seen as a threat, really. Thank you very much for that. Next up is Luisa Martinez, who is the DSA co-chair in Portland, Oregon. She's also on the DSA National Political Committee. She has been an election observer in Venezuela twice and an election observer in Mexico. She is a full-time union organizer. Luisa Martinez, you are up next. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Feel a little bit like under the boot of that timer. It's like a lot of pressure. Okay, so yes, I've been an observer two times. I won't really talk about that because for the most part, it's pretty uneventful because of the voting system that Venezuela has, which has been praised. Every time the two times that I've been an election observer, you can talk to anybody, get anybody's opinion, and there's not really a whole lot of drama at the polls. That's different from when I was an election observer in Mexico. But what I'm going to talk about is the kind of the background of Maria Corina Machado and El Mundo, right? And El Mundo was technically running for president, but it was really Maria Corina Machado. Like, she was the one. If you paid attention to any part of their campaign following up to the elections, it was pretty clear that they were asserting, if they don't win, it's fraud, right? This was before election days, right? So none of this kind of what happened afterwards should be a surprise to anybody who was paying attention, right? In terms of their narrative. And I want to be clear, this is the extreme right wing. Maria Corina Machado and El Mundo, for reasons I'll explain, represent the far right. This is the fascist right of Venezuela. In total, there were 9 opposition candidates. So they weren't even the only opposition candidates. It's really funny when you explain to people, there were 10 people running for president of Venezuela. It doesn't really sound like a dictatorship to me, but that's the truth. And also the right wing is split. Right. And part of the reason they're split is this question of violence. Right. Clearly, Maria Corina Machado and El Mundo represent the wing of the opposition that very much resorts to violence. So I'll say personally, there were hundreds of electoral observers in Venezuela. there were 12 people from my hotel, which Gloria was saying at, that missed their flights because immediately the right wing started with the violence, right? And so they started paying people to set things on fire. There was a number of things that were destroyed. So 12 universities, 7 public preschools, 21 elementary schools, 37 public healthcare centers. Their like signature is like setting fire to like hospitals, right? That's really, if they had a, if there was something that pointed to what the right wing loves to do, the fascist right wing loves to do, is just, they just love to burn state institutions, particularly that the institutions that help poor people in Venezuela. But Maria Corina Machado, just to give some background, she has been trying to build her own parallel CNE, her right-wing parallel CNE, for 20 years. And she's also been crying fraud for 20 years. So again, anybody who's paying attention or knows anything about Venezuela shouldn't be surprised about what's going on. And so she's created a parallel CNE called Sumate. You can imagine who it's funded by. Spoiler alert, the National Endowment for Democracy. And so the Sumate was actually one of the organization that led the recall against Chavez in 2004. There was a presidential recall. And so she was disqualified as running for a presidential candidate because she took a position with the Panamanian government. And that is a violation of the Venezuelan constitution. You can't work for another government and then keep a foot in your first country and say, no, I'm going to run for president. Right. So she was disqualified. And so what she did was she picked out this guy who was not an active like political actor named Edmundo. And so, but could be manipulated. And so he ran. But the campaign, again, anybody who's paying attention, was about Maria Corina Machado. And so Edmundo has even worse history. He was, one thing about Venezuela before the revolution you have to understand is that it was a client state of the United States, and it kind of functioned like Colombia before Petro. And so it was a vessel for the United States to export violence to Latin America, right? And so he was a diplomatic official to El Salvador. His boss was Leopoldo Castillo, aka Matacuras, which is, in English means priest killer, because Castillo and Edmundo were 2 people who coordinated the death squads that killed Spanish priests, and they were working on a peace agreement between FMLN and the government of El Salvador. So that was his boss, and he worked in that office, right? And this was, this is Edmundo. This is the guy who claims that he won, right? And so what people don't understand is that once you explain to liberals that this is basically January 6th, right? They start, I think that is one entryway into explaining the situation. And so, once you learn kind of the background of these people, you see what little credibility that they have. Also, Edmundo has not shown up to a single Supreme Court meeting, right, where where the elections were discussed, right? So he's actually in contempt of court for never. So as much as the fascist right wing claims to have won, they never once showed up to court to actually prove it, right? Because the point was always to cry fraud. It's not like something happened where it made them go, oh, we better go to the press. That was always the plan all along. And briefly on the numbers, let me see where I am with there we go, the timer. So I have a long list of numbers I'm not going to go into, but basically I just want to make this point that if you look where there was the highest level of participation, it was 2012. There's 80% of the population. This was before you saw people leaving Venezuela, maybe a small percentage of the middle class, but for the most part, you didn't see like the waves of migration that we're seeing now. With 80% of the participation, Chavez won 8.1 million votes, right? Maria Corina Machado is claiming, or the fascist right wing is claiming that Edmundo won 7.1 million votes. And this was with 59% of the turnout, right? Mathematically, that doesn't make sense, especially considering the migration waves out of Venezuela, that it's not unlike Cuba, right? And so it just doesn't add up in terms of what their claims are. And And so the last thing I'll go into with the 4 minutes I have left is the regional response. So you have kind of three flavors of response. First is just accepting the sovereignty of Venezuela. So you have Cuba, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Bolivia that congratulated Maduro on his win. And then you had this kind of middle wing, which is, and then you have the far right, right? Like Chile, like, of course, Milei recognized Edmundo as president. And so then you have sort of something that exists in the middle. And so AMLO, I will say, has taken just repeated that the United States absolutely should not intervene and very much played an anti-interventionist role, right? He has a lot, I will say, with respect to Colombia, he has a lot more leverage, right? That ultimately he controls the border. And so he has more power to vocalize that, to say that he doesn't support intervention and the United States needs to keep out. Colombia is a little bit different. Petro is a very weak president. He's the leader of a coalition that he can't exactly control. And he relies a lot on the United States in order to achieve his own political agenda, which is paz total, right? He can't achieve total peace without the cooperation of the United States. And so he's just very weak, and he's really not this is not an excuse, it's more like an explanation that he chose not to take this up as a political issue. And then lastly, you have Brazil, which is probably the most disappointing of all the responses. Chile, Boric sucks, that's not surprising, but Lula was that he's really made it a point to break from the grassroots, that you have MS2, who we saw there, El Foro de Sao Paulo, they issued a congratulatory statement shortly after the elections. Alba, and even his own party, PT, it seems like he's gone out of his way to separate himself in terms of trying to be this mediator between the United States and Venezuela, saying that they need to call for a new election, they need to learn how to co-govern with the right wing. These are fascists. These are people who set hospitals, who pay people to set hospitals on fire, right? Anywhere between $150 to $200, right? They pay poor people to do these things. And so I don't know, for one thing, I don't know how you can go govern with those types of, with fascists, but for another thing, that's not a constitutional, there's nothing in the Venezuelan constitution that says you're going to hold new elections. That's just not a constitutional solution, right? And so, what's particularly disappointing is that Brazil had its own January 6th, right? Where people who supported Bolsonaro, they cried fraud, and Venezuela immediately came to Lula's aid. So it's really disappointing that has not been reciprocated. And I will just say, and again, you're very much getting my side of the story, that is this the type of bargain with empire that got him thrown in jail for almost 2 years and got Dilma a coup. You can't, there's no bargaining with empire. So, another thing I will add is that the time left. This has become a domestic issue in some of these countries because you've had migration out, and again, because it's not unlike the waves of Cuban migration, that it's become domestic issues in these countries. So that also plays a part of it. But to end on a better note, the left in Latin America has been fractured, but because Maduro threatened to move oil and gas contracts, the United States started walking back its recognition of Edmundo. So Venezuela does have leverage and has wielded it, and I think that's a really positive note to end on. I think this would have gone much poorly 10 years ago, and this is not the ideal situation. But again, I do think that there has been some progress in that sense. So I'll end my comments there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa, for that broad. Thank you for the music. Music is actually very useful, but thank you for that broad and insightful analysis, and thank you for ending on time. And we're moving on to our next speaker, who's Gloria LaRiva, who is a national leader for the Party for Socialism and Liberation. She too is an observer of the election, has been to Venezuela repeatedly since the late 1990s. In 2020, she ran for the U.S. president on the PSL as a PSL candidate and received over 86,000 votes, including over 6,000 in Florida. She was an officer of her union for decades before retiring. So, Gloria, please give us your thoughts about the situation in Venezuela and how it fits into the world situation.
Thank you, Lorenzo and Jeff and all those who worked to make this forum possible. And I'm glad it's recorded because there can't be enough education about Venezuela, which is not only demonized in the US media, but also misunderstood, unfortunately, among a lot of the left. First thing I want to say, having been in Venezuela during these elections, is an empirical observation. If Maduro and the PSUV was really guilty of fraud, do you think they really would have come up on election night with a result of 51.2%? I mean, you'd think they would have come up with a higher figure. Unlike the opposition, which says that they won by almost 70%, and that's really ridiculous. But there are so many safeguards in the electronic voting system, in addition to the fact that every party in the elections had to have a technician come to see the whole operating system, the internal operating system of the electronics, to sign on and say, yes, we consider this valid and foolproof. But in fact, the sabotage came from outside, not to the system itself, but to the offices and the power of the CNE. And my theme of my talk was, how is it that Venezuela has survived 25 years of US economic, financial, political, and military power in order to try to undermine the revolution? There have been endless plots. And if we were to go through them, it's truly astounding that Venezuela's revolution has survived. But I want to just mention a few. The April 2002 coup that overthrew Chavez for almost 48 hours. The October 2002 oil sabotage that lasted several months. And somebody has been sending in chats different accusations saying, oh, the sanctions began later, and that the government itself was responsible for the economic crisis. But in fact, when the oil coup took place, oil sabotage of several months in late October 2002, inflation was up by several 100,000%. The stores were empty. The oil was sabotaged, and it took an enormous effort to recover it. And then another main one, even though there have been others, was that only 10 days after Maduro's second inauguration, second victory, on January 10th, came Juan Guaido, who suddenly appeared after being anointed by the Trump administration. And as we all know, the US used Guaido to steal the Citgo refineries, the reserves, the oil, the money reserves, gold in the London, Portugal banks. Of course, it was under Trump, but the sanctions regime began with the resolution that Barack Obama signed in March 2015. Every aspect of Venezuela's solidarity with the world has been hampered. The oil, the heating oil that Chavez offered by the hundreds of millions of gallons to indigenous and poor communities in the United States, that was thwarted. The Petrocaribe to the Caribbean nations, the Secretary of State went throughout the Caribbean under Obama's presidency to warn them that they had to back off of working with Venezuela, even though it benefited them. And the key, I think, to the survival of Venezuela is Hugo Chavez's deep understanding that it could not just be one man based on his presidency, but the people as a whole who must make the revolution. He knew he had to be more than just president, but to lead and transform the system itself. And I don't think it could have been possible without Cuba's solidarity. I think that Chavez was so extremely bold and never backing down or shying away from his complete solidarity with the Cuban Revolution and the lessons learned. I was, for example, one time in Venezuela for the first time one time in July 2001. Chavez had been president for less than 2 years. Much had been done, but the goals of the revolution had yet to be achieved because he faced a majority opposition in the National Assembly. And in that visit, Chavez led a march through the streets of Caracas, accompanying the wagon that carried Simón Bolívar's sword. With thousands of people, they were handing, as they could reach Chavez, they handed him pieces of paper, begging for help, saying, Chavez, I don't have a home. Chavez, my children need clothes. Chavez, we don't have money. Chavez took those papers, gave them to his assistants to give attention to the people. Obviously, what was needed was a deeper transformation and institutionalization of the benefits. And that transformation began, interestingly, with the US-backed coup that overthrew Chavez in April 2002. Why do I say that? Because in those 48 hours before he was restored to office, the people, even though the television was blacked out, the people mobilized by the tens of thousands to rescue Chavez, along with the loyal members of the military who brought him back. He was returned to his rightful place. And I'll never forget how we who were watching those hours, we thought, okay, wow, it's over. But to see him brought back in an unprecedented action, I don't think anything like that ever happened before. And yet the war was not over. In many ways, it was beginning. And this is where Cuba stepped in. Because when the oil crisis was underway in late 2002, I was in Brazil for the World Social Forum, over 100,000 activists from Latin America, mainly the Caribbean and North America. And Cuba, Fidel was going to send 45 people for Cuba's participation in the forum. But with the crisis for Venezuela, he gathered 250 leaders, revolutionaries, academics, and others in Cuba and said, you're going to go to Venezuela. He said, take a sheet, a pillow. Maybe you might have to sleep in the street because there may not be hotel rooms, but you're going to go defend Venezuela. And those of us who were there, we saw the 50,000 copies of a book that Cuba, hot off the press, had just printed of Chavez's speeches to the people and to the world of what Venezuela was facing. And that's what Fidel and Cuba did. They had 50,000 books on pallets openly in the forum so that people could pick them up. This was Cuba's support, political support. And in April, after the oil sabotage was over, Cuba began sending its first medical doctors, teams and teams. And yet the healthcare system, being completely private, would not let the doctors operate in those hospitals. What did Chavez do? He called on the women to open up their homes so that they could set up little clinics in those homes. I visited some of them. Women in their humble homes, opening up a room so that the doctors, the Cuban doctors, could operate. Of course, with resources, Venezuela began to build hospitals, clinics as a challenge to the private healthcare system. The biggest contribution, I think, of Chavez was the creation of a party, a socialist party, to bring the masses in to advocate for themselves in their neighborhoods, to become politically aware of what they're really fighting for. But first, I think that Cuba's involvement in the medical care that was free, not only doctors, but psychologists, psychiatrists, and dentists, and also the Yo Si Puedo educational literacy campaign. Venezuela became the second country of the Americas to eliminate illiteracy thanks to Cuban teachers. And on and on. I think the education of these benefits helped the people see what a radical transformation really meant. And the formation of the PSUV, it was not just one party, but that Chavez and then later Maduro have worked so hard to try to bring the patriotic forces together in the Grand Patriotic Pole. And even with the opposition and the history of people like Corinna Machado that the other speakers have well explained, and that of Edmundo Gonzalez, of counter-revolutionaries, Maduro has still, in a very brilliant way, opened the doors to say, let's dialogue. We need peace in the country. We don't want intervention. We don't want overthrow. We don't want the violence. And so then this is why in January of this year, the Barbados Agreement was signed by the different parties, the opposition, by the Grand Patriotic Pole parties, including the PSUV, and international observers. And so yesterday in the New York Times came another fantastical accusation of dictatorship of the autocrat Maduro, and brought out a man who hadn't been speaking before. He was silent. They brought him up, Juan Carlos Delfino, and he's brought up to say, I never agreed to this CNE. He was part of the Electoral Commission. He lives in the US, by the way. There's more to be said about that. But he has trotted out to try to say that there was no fair elections. And it can be completely discredited and explained. And I want to recommend people to read the website Misión Verdad, mission, but with one S, Misión Verdad, missiontruth.com. It's an excellent source, day to day, to counter the lies about the elections. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. And thank you in particular for explaining how the institutions were built with Cuban assistance, with the leadership of Chavez, to what people were defending through the process of the election, that they were defending an institution, the socialist ideals that were being developed, essentially building on what Corinna was talking about, also about an institution that countered the capitalist model that had been being pushed, and the privatization model that was being pushed also by the opposition. Finally, our last speaker is Yves Engler, a Montreal-based activist and author who is focused on Canada's role in Venezuela. Yves, give us your insights.
So first of all, thanks for putting this on. I'm coming to you from what Carlos Ron, the Deputy Foreign Minister, calls the dwarf empire of Canada. That was his response to Canada's response to the elections, which was a couple of days ago. Canada's foreign minister tweeted out, "Yesterday's ruling made by Nicolas Maduro's Supreme Tribunal of Justice that Maduro won the July 20 election are not credible. In view of the clear preference expressed by the people of Venezuela based upon the available evidence, Canada calls on Venezuelan authorities to respect democracy and human rights and to begin the transition process in recognition of the true results of the election." That is similar to what the Deputy Prime Minister, former Foreign Affairs Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, a very prominent person in global capitalism, right after the election, she said that Canada has been supporting the democratic opposition and condemning an increasingly severe authoritarian regime in Venezuela for many years now. I want people of Venezuela, the Democrats of Venezuela, to know that Canada stands with them and recognizes that they are fighting hard for democracy and freedom. So the Canadian government, Chrystia Freeland, when she was appointed foreign minister, the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa sent a cable to the State Department saying that Canada has adopted an America First foreign policy. That was, of course, during the Trump years. So this is, she was really the person who spearheaded Canada's hard, aggressive position against the Venezuelan government. And it goes a little under the radar, but because they did a good PR stunt. They called it the Lima Group back in mid-2017. The Canadian Prime Minister and leader of Peru got together, and they decided to come up with this coalition of governments opposing Venezuela's government. And it's a bit better PR to call it the Lima Group than to call it the Ottawa Group. You probably could also call it the Washington Group, but Ottawa Group would be a bit better PR, and Lima Group's a little bit better PR than that. And it was a coalition of governments to overthrow Venezuela's government. And Canada, leading player in the Lima Group. And that, of course, we know what happened in the 2018 election. Even though there was a boycott, Maduro won more votes than Justin Trudeau won, right? He got 2/3 of 40% of a turnout, which was higher than Justin Trudeau's proportion of the Canadian electorate. But of course, they said that was illegitimate. And then they launched a whole series. Canada brought in 4 rounds of sanctions. They took Venezuela to the International Criminal Court, right? So while our government here has been threatening to cut off ICC funding if they investigate Israeli war crimes, and that's what the Canadian government's been doing for a number of years, they said that there's more substantial human rights violations taking place in Venezuela. We have to bring Maduro to the ICC. Canada's been funding opposition groups in Venezuela for many years now. One of the groups you see quoted a lot in the media, Foro Penal, they've been recipient of Canadian government funding. There's this human rights award that the Canadian Embassy was giving out for many years. Always it went to these opposition NGOs that were basically campaigning against the government. And so Canada has its hands in destabilizing the Venezuelan government. Now, when Juan Guaido self-declared in January of 2019, it came out, the corporate media here reported that Canadian diplomats spent, quote, months coordinating the plan to have Guaido self-declare as president, with both with the rest of the opposition, but also coordinating it internationally and generating international backing for Guaido being the legitimate leader. You have Canadian Prime Minister officials repeatedly referring to Maduro as a brutal dictator. And throughout 2019, the Canadian campaign against the legitimate government of Venezuela was like, the diplomatic efforts were really quite stunning. And the Prime Minister, in literally like dozens of calls with leaders all around the world, the readout of those calls would always talk about Venezuela. So when the Canadian Prime Minister is speaking to the leader of Japan, they bring up Venezuela. That's like one of like three items that were purportedly discussed in these meetings. And what Japan has to do with Venezuela, what Japan has to do with Venezuela. I mean, we're talking about seriously tangential. And so the Canadian government was basically worked aggressively throughout 2019 to try to get the rest of the world to use its diplomatic cover, right? It's not, Canada's not viewed as quite as belligerent as the US is. And so there's some diplomatic realms in which Canadian government trying to push the Juan Guaido thing maybe made more sense than the US. And so it was really quite a remarkable effort by the Canadian government to generate backing for this illegitimate process. Guaido, of course, was brought to Ottawa. The Canadian government repeatedly called on the military in Venezuela to overthrow Maduro. So it really was a full-fledged, quite a remarkable campaign. Now, a lot of people, when they hear about Canada's role, they think, oh, well, like I kind of said, there's this perception of Canada as, peacekeeping. It's not viewed as quite as an imperialistic of a nation. That's a misconception, right? I just published a book, co-authored a book called Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy. And Owen Schock and I, we detail Canada's role in more than 20 different coups since the 1950s. And there's, varying degrees of involvement. Some of it's kind of passive. And then there's the examples where it's quite aggressive. And we talked about, it's been raised that, how elections are used as destabilization efforts or events to destabilize governments. And the example of Bolivia was in 2019 was brought up, and the whole role of the Organization of American States. Canada played quite a substantial role in that whole process of delegitimizing the electoral win of Evo Morales, which gave the momentum to the opposition protests and ultimately led to the ouster of Morales. But there's probably even a more egregious example is the case of Haiti in 2000. It's really actually a totally amazing feat of imperial propaganda, where you have this election in May of 2000 where the Jean-Bertrand Aristide is not overseeing the elections and he's not participating in elections. But that event is used to then destabilize his elected government, ultimately lead to a U.S., Canadian, French foreign invasion to oust him. And so in that case, I get into all the specifics, but basically after Aristide's Famille Lavalasse party wins, basically all of 7,000 elected, 80% of 7,000 elected positions, opposition cries foul around some senatorial positions they claimed should have gone to the second round, should have been a runoff. That's a debatable question of whether that's correct or not, but everyone knew how they were going to count the ballots beforehand. And they used that to justify boycotting the presidential elections, which were taking place 6 months later in November of 2000. And then the US and Canada used the supposed like electoral deficiency in the senatorial and mayoral elections of May 2000 to then cut off aid to the Haitian government that they'd already committed to, and that was all part of this destabilization process. And then Canada, with like special forces, play a role in physically assisting or securing the airport, in which Aristide is forced onto a plane and then dumped in the Central African Republic in the middle of the night by U.S. Marines. So Canada has this long history of certainly aligning with the U.S. empire in overthrowing democracy, particularly in this hemisphere, but more broadly. And so that gets to the why question. You know, Canada, why would the Canadian government be so involved in this coup? And part of it, of course, is supporting the U.S. Part of it is hostility to the Latin American integration project, right? When the CELAC, the Community of Latin American States, they include every country except two, right? The U.S., Cuba is included, unlike the OAS, but Canada and the U.S. are excluded, right? So the Canadian government has shown repeatedly it opposes Latin American integration efforts. But the other question is Canadian capital. And Petro-Canada was angry at Chavez for nationalizing. Canadian Bank, Scotiabank was angry at Chavez for nationalizing. But probably the most important part is Canadian mining. Canada is a dominant mining player all throughout the hemisphere. And they repeatedly see Venezuela's nationalistic mining as a threat to their interests, not just in Venezuela, and there's Canadian companies with a big lawsuit, but across the region more generally. So Canada is very much allied with the imperial project and wants to destroy the Bolivarian social transformation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yves, for bringing to our attention something that many people forget or just don't know about, the Canadian dimension of imperialism and its role, particularly here in this particular situation. I'm going to turn this MC role over to Carolina, who's going to moderate a more discussion-oriented segment of this forum. So, Carolina.
Thank you very much. So we are going to now move on to discussion. The questions that we are going to be posting are for everyone. So actually, hold on one second. I'm going to remove everyone from the spotlight so that we can have an open room. And feel free to jump in if you were one of the speakers to answer any of these questions. Earlier tonight, somebody asked, why did the Carter Center criticize the election? Weren't the tallies the opposition presented copies of original results of the polling stations? And don't they show Gonzalez getting 66%? So whoever wants to take that, just feel free to jump in.
Sure, I can take that. They waived the results, the tallies in front of the international press, but they never produced it at the Supreme Court. So there was no way that I mean, if they believed what they were saying, then they had to produce it in the Supreme Court. Instead, I mean, Gonzalez was held in contempt of court. And he's being the alliance, the opposition alliance, is being investigated now for fraudulent documents. I mean, I don't know if it's if it's real, it had to be produced in front of the Supreme Court. Otherwise, I don't know why we would believe them.
Yeah. And thank you, Luisa, for dropping that link on the chat. Do you want to jump in? Or I see Gloria wants to jump in.
Just real quickly, I went to Corinna Machado's rally 2 days after the election. She called for a big mass rally, and I went there. The audience was very distinctly different from the mass rallies for Maduro. But anyway, when she appeared, she did all the talking just about, and she made an interesting statement. She was very livid, and she said, it doesn't matter. We're not going to accept a recount. It's too late for that. So there was never really intent from the very beginning, weeks ago, to now, to take part in a real election and to honor the results. But in addition, she had people come up, they climbed up onto the truck to present their actas, the ballots. It was a show. And I really recommend reading misionverdad.com, the website, because they go through analysis of, they say that up to 83% of those ballots that were supposedly shown on their websites that they've created of the opposition, that analysts show that they've been manipulated electronically. And they don't correspond to what has been revealed in the actual count. There's a lot to study about this, but they never intended to honor this.
Can I just add just quickly that there were charges that before the election, the opposition was raising that if they didn't win, it would be fraudulent. So this is part of the destabilization plan that was going on before, during, and after the election.
Yep. So Corinna and then Luisa have their hands up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that as well. What Audrey just said, for weeks before the election, they were talking about possible fraud, and that was just to raise these questions in people's minds and to really soften the public for the kind of intervention that followed, and the attempted coup and the violence. And there was also these polls, these fraudulent polls that were used before. I would also urge people to read Venezuela analysis. They pointed out that there's a quote from their article. They say polling in Venezuela is considered unreliable, with pollsters historically showing measurable pro-opposition bias. But even a pro-opposition pollster, Data Analysis, predicted a narrow Maduro victory on July 28th. And of course, none of the press picked up on that. So, this was all part of the intervention. And, we can see it happening before as well as after with the exit polls. And I think it was Ben Norton who pointed out, what was it, Edison polls, one of the polling station, which was connected to the CIA, also was putting out distorted numbers about the exit polls. So, and I believe exit polls are illegal in Venezuela to boot. So yeah, this is all part of the intervention.
Wow, that's impressive. Luisa?
One thing I'll just add is that people keep tossing in this Carter Center thing. The reason why that was ever important is because Jimmy Carter himself, the former US president, the former president of Empire, called the Venezuelan electoral system the best in the world. The reason why it's important is that because he said it. Nobody gives a shit about the Carter Center things. With all due respect, nobody jumps up in the morning and says, oh, what does the Carter Center think about Medicaid reallotment? Let me turn on the Carter Center app and jump on the Carter Center Instagram and see what the Carter Center thinks about varying issues about Palestine. The thrust of anything to do with the Carter Center really does go back to what he said as a former US president. But there's an NGO. They're an NGO in the United States, just like any other NGO. You can look at their funding sources. But I just wanted to make that point. It was really that Jimmy Carter said it.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to jump in? Okay, let's go to the second question. I'm going to post it on the chat as well. So the question was, why was Machado not allowed to run? Anybody wants to take that one?
I mean, I think I
Gloria,
kind of,
go ahead.
okay, sorry.
You're muted.
You know, she was convicted of taking on a government role in another country, which is a violation of the Constitution. You know, we have to, I think when we talk to the common people, the people that we meet, people who ask us at work or people who know us as activists, they do wonder because they're flooded with all these myths and lies. And I think the essence is that Venezuela has institutions. They have a constitution that the first time in 25 constitutions was voted on by the people. We still have an old constitution that doesn't guarantee us, you know, they can interpret however they want, the right wing, but they have institutions and they have laws. And that's why when Maduro and the Patriotic Pole went to the Supreme Court to ask them to take on the investigation, the only ones who didn't participate was Machado and Gonzalez in violation. They were ordered to participate. But I also, here's an interesting point. In 2015, when the left, when the PSUV and the Patriotic Pole lost the elections by a wide margin in the super majority that the right wing won the National Assembly, the government respected that. It was a huge, devastating blow, but the government respected that. And the right wing has never respected any election outcome except two that they won, the National Assembly in 2015 and the attempt at the constitutional amendment that Chavez had proposed years before that was defeated. But the government, the PSUV, respected that. And I think we should remind people of that. What did Maduro and them do, the revolutionaries, in facing this defeat? They struggle against the National Assembly, for example, when they passed a law to privatize all the housing that had been built. At that time, 3 million homes. They were going to give private title to everyone so that it could be turned over to the real estate industry. Well, the Supreme Court ruled correctly that to privatize a housing would be a violation of the constitutional guarantee to the right to housing. Because housing,
Thank you, Gloria.
anyway.
I wanted to open the space just to see if anyone has anything to add or a rebuttal so that we can move on to the next question. Okay, let's move on to the next question then. What has your experience been in getting the interest of unions and community groups on this issue, and how did you do it? Any of the panelists? Corinna, go ahead.
I can't say that I've been very successful in terms of union organizing, more so in terms of community groups. But I would say it's a real struggle in union. I'm myself am a delegate in my union. We're a local of the AFT, and I'm a professor at City University of New York, so Professional Staff Congress. And you know, it's a real issue. It's a struggle because the left in this country is, you know, his a history of chauvinism, really. And, you know, it's connected to labor aristocracy and really benefiting from the profits of exploiting global South labor. And, you know, the global South working class, global South resources, and the extraction of wealth. So it's very difficult it's difficult often to make these kinds of arguments and to really help people to stand in solidarity with the working class in the global South. But in particular, to move beyond the kind of hegemonic liberalism, that so many unions are stuck in. And that is really what, on the one hand, you have people saying things like, well, the Venezuelan government isn't radical enough, right? And these are the same people who their horizons of the left in this country are Bernie Sanders, but the fact that Maduro hasn't expropriated private property in Venezuela means he hasn't gone far enough. But then on the other hand, the accusations of not being democratic enough, so there are all of these contradictions and confusion that really come, I think, from a place of chauvinism, from not taking the lead and learning from the lessons of people who are on the forefront of these struggles. What does the left in the US have to learn from these working class struggles, from the experience of the communes, from the experience of, attempting to bring a socialist revolution through electoral politics? So yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with chauvinism. I think the working class, especially communities of color, especially other, people who have an anti-imperialist consciousness, those are people who make these connections automatically. But I think there's a lot of work to be done in our trade unions to move beyond the kind of framework of hegemonic liberalism and labor aristocracy, unfortunately.
Hi, Corinna, I cannot agree with you more. I think that I always say this, it's like the Kool-Aid was buy one, get one, because people have been drinking so much of that, and they continue to, even though they criticize Republicans, they continue to feel that, oh, America the best, America the great, and whatever, and they stop criticizing, and they just jump in this wagon where they lose all of this objectivity and the chances of really thinking for themselves. So really interesting, and thank you for your comments, Luisa.
So I am a union organizer for state employees. And I feel like it's really important to frame it in a way where it's clear that these types of things affect them. And I think it's important because, one, that's much more of a winning strategy, but also if we frame international solidarity, if we frame just the issues in the global South any other way, it's charity, right? Which is like the worst thing, at least in my opinion. We don't do the activism that we do because out of a sense of charity, right? That's what liberals do. We do it because ultimately we all have the same goal, right? And so part of framing the situation in a way that clearly affects them is talking about how massive the U.S. military budget is, right? And how, and framing an alternative vision for that money, what could be provided, especially when it comes to, again, state employees, about what could be available in terms, not just the salary increases, but like, public services and stuff like that. How many things we could have as inhabitants, as denizens, if we didn't spend so much money on exporting violence to the global South. So I do think it's important to make it relevant to them, because if we just say poor Venezuelans, I don't think, I really try not to just frame Venezuelans as victims. I don't think that's I feel like that's inappropriate. I think you should frame it in terms of we're all in the same fight together.
Love it. And it also applies to Haiti and to all of these other places where our hands are clearly seen and marked in blood, and really where you see some quote unquote good people trying to do some charity work there, and it's just this perpetuation of not understanding the issue and much less means to solve it. So we have one last question, and sorry that we're going above time, but this is an important question. how should we as community organizers deal with reactionary forces that exist in Florida? Similarly, how would you speak with misguided people on the left who remain against Maduro but still critical of the US? So again, this question is open for anyone on the floor, panelists. Go ahead, Gloria. I see your hand.
I think basically to start off by talking with people that the U.S. the U.S. government claims to speak in our name and says we need democracy in the world, but we have no business, and the U.S. government has no business dictating to anybody in the world what's a democracy. We have our own struggle at home. It's just this election, for example. And the thing about, I think, Peyton, you're in Tampa. It's a tough thing. It's a tough thing in Miami, in Tampa, but in other communities too. Half 500,000 Venezuelans have been given permission to work now, legal permission on the road to green cards that even Mexicans and other immigrants don't have a right to, thanks to Biden last October. So, for example, we had a protest here over a week ago, and we didn't publicize it because we didn't have the means at that point to defend it. And there were 300 Venezuelans, very angry, very worked up. And if they had known of our protest, we would have faced a big problem. I think the same thing in Tampa. What we did in Phoenix, I was on a national tour. And what we did, because we were getting hit by Venezuelans everywhere when we had public meeting, we said to come into the university hall. Everybody who came had to show their ID in front of their face, and we would take a picture of everybody coming in. And as soon as the event was over, we would erase all the pictures. And of course, they self-censored and didn't go in, the ones who were going to disrupt. So that's just a little thing. I don't know. It's careful. Maybe a classroom where you can talk.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would? Okay, go ahead, Audrey.
Yeah, I can deal with just the issue of the misguided part of the left. Just as, in my opinion, just as there's U.S. exceptionalism, where the U.S. feels it is the policeman of the world and is the arbiter of democracy when we really don't have it here. There's the same U.S. left exceptionalism, where people on the left, I guess it's what Corinna was saying, is chauvinism, that people in the U.S. left feel that they're arbiters also of democracy around the world and socialism around the world. And it's important that, that we keep emphasizing rights to sovereignty and self-determination in the global South.
Absolutely. So if you have been the one that spoke the least, that's why I was putting you on the spotlight. Is there anything that you want to add?
No, not
okay.
particularly.
Perfect. So I really like the way that this portion of the discussion came naturally. It was very organic because it came to where we started. And that was us talking about labor and solidarity. So we're going to, Jeff, go ahead.
I think Luisa had one more comment.
Oh, Luisa, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry, I missed you.
No worries. So I grew up in South Florida. I get it. And so I didn't have quite the temperance for this then, when I was younger. Now I'm old and haggard, right? But I mean, I get the atmosphere in Florida. And so one thing is, I feel like it would be probably what they want the most in terms of solidarity with Venezuela is trying to get something together to show support for ending the sanctions, the illegal sanctions in Venezuela. You don't have to love Maduro to want to end the sanctions, right? And so I have two things. I think the National Network on Cuba is actually a great model for this. where there's a big coalition of people, you know, many of which are not Fidelistas, but are very much spend time, you know, focusing on the blockade, ending the blockade. And so, you know, Juan Guaido also spoke recently in Portland, and the folks who organized for him to come were actually shocked to learn that there's actually a lot of right-wing Venezuelans that don't like him because he's a criminal and because he stole money from the government. And so he's actually not liked by the right wing. And so I think you can find, if ending sanctions is a unifying issue, that's really what they're at. Like, that's also reflects our responsibility as people who live, you know, in the seat of empire, in terms of probably what we should be doing, right? Focusing on. And I use that in my organization as a way to teach about Venezuela, see what we can learn from movements on the ground, from the communes and stuff like that. But you know, particularly in South Florida, particularly in Florida, which at least at some point was a swing state, you know, that's where you hear support for illegal sanctions. And so I think it would be really refreshing to hear from constituents, these elected people, to hear that there actually isn't support for them. So yeah, I think unifying people around an issue like that is perfectly, you know, doable. Oh, and one more thing. I'm so sorry, Killian. I was in Miami when Obama opened up Cuba, right? When he said that he would start talks in terms of opening Cuba. And I worked with a lot of Cuban descendant people, and not a single one of them were like, oh, this is bullshit. They were like, yeah, you know, it hasn't been working, let's try it. Right. So that was a surprise to me. So I think that there's a lot more support for it than maybe we realize. So that's it, on to there.
Thank you. And very true too. We see here there's groups like Fuentes de Amor and many others that are able to mobilize people from both of the main parties and even some NPAs on that particular issue. Corinna, go ahead.
Just to say very quickly and to follow on what Luisa was saying, I think one really important talking point for the left and labor in the US is the communes. You know, when I was in Venezuela last summer, we met with the leaders of El Panal, and they told us, you know, they said that they could not, the commune project would end if Maduro, if the PSUV didn't win. I think that's really important because I think Carolina said you don't have to love Maduro to love the people. The people love Maduro. The masses, the working class love Maduro. And people here need to know that. And, you know, and I think that is one way because, you know, I do find that that's lacking from left analysis here. It's almost intentionally left out, the communes. And every time I raise that with so-called leftists who are opposing Venezuela and opposing Maduro, they have no response because, you know, here we have an example of real working class power, much more power than trade unions in this country have. So again, you know, I think that's part of what it is about challenging the chauvinism, learning from the example of Venezuela and reminding people this is where the working class in Venezuela stand. This is where, you know, if you want to be in solidarity with workers, this is what it means. And yes, opposing sanctions absolutely is, you know, a must.
Awesome. So we have come to the end of this portion. I was trying to respond to some people that were sending me direct messages about the video and the chat. For the chat, just a reminder, you can click on the 3 dots and save the chat if you want to save it for the links or whatever. And for the video, you would email Lorenzo and he's going to share with you the link so that you can watch it and share it with anybody that you want. So with that said, I want to thank everyone for your participation and pass the mic on to Lorenzo, who's going to close us up for the night. Again, thank you very much for participating in this very important discussion.
I'm going to be echoing what Carolina has been saying in terms of thanking not only the panelists, but also the people that were present here in this discussion. As we can perceive, we are still have a long way to go in terms of making this issue very much part of the national consciousness, an issue that is of great importance, as we all heard here. One of the things, the elephant in the room, is that the danger of a possible war, because it seems that the U.S. is persistent in trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government. And it's very important that we are very much aware of that possibility and continue our work towards enhancing the education of our people in regards to this. As many people have said before and was taken in the questions, it's sad that many people on the left that should have been here are not here. God knows what reason, but one of the things that we know is that people are scared of touching this issue because there has been a very good work done by the opposition in terms of scaring people to what's happening in Venezuela. And as many of the panelists said, what happening in Venezuela is an example that can be translated into the actual work that we are doing here. Carolina mentioned, and we are committed to providing the video to whoever desires to have the video. It's really important that that video be circulated among friends that might have not. I mean, we already know several people that couldn't come tonight that are already asking for the video. So whoever cannot want to use it to be able to talk to other people, please do that. One of the things from LCA point of view is that we are very found to be engaged in the struggle of supporting national liberation movements and the international working class. And we are very much into the work geared towards that will transition our nation from the world hegemon into a participant with the other nations in doing the best we can for the world, and climate change, improving the life of the peoples in the world, cut down poverty, all these things that are so necessary, improve healthcare, improve the lifespan of people, all of these things that needs to be done. We are very much in tune to work towards that, because one of the main things that is kept as a secret is that if we cease to be the world's hegemon, this will improve the lives of the working class in our country. So, to conclude, the work of the LCA can be translated into three basic parts, and I see from the chat that people do understand what we're doing. And one of the things that we do, and we need to communicate that to the outside world, is that we are into educating people without education, we cannot go too far. People need to be educated. We need to agitate so others understand why are we doing what we're doing, and also then organize. And this is also an invitation to all of you here that want to help us, be part of us. We are a good group of people, work very well cohesively. And if you are interested, please, I request a couple of minutes be left after I finish for people if they want to put their email address in the chat or send it to me directly so we can put you on the email list, and be connected with you and see ways of involving you in the work that we do. We love what you're doing, and we love having to do the little bit to be able to move the needle forward. And that's what we're doing. Thank you very much for your attendance. We love